Wonderful to see you all. Thank you for joining us again, or if this is your first time, we'll try to do a little catch up a little later at the end of our session. I'm really very delighted that I'm able to be with you tonight along with Rabbi Zerin. So we have a chance to work together. It's a very exciting prospect. And I'm sure that you will learn a great deal from her as well. We have taken our entire group here on a bit of a journey from the beginnings of Jewish modernity, from the life of Moses Mendelssohn in the 18th century, and trying to bring things to today in a very significant way. With the last of the thinkers we're going to get a taste from, and I emphasize just a taste because there's much, much more depth to each and every one of the people that we are talking about. And I'm very delighted that Rabbi Zerin is here to represent one of the great Jewish feminist thinkers in modernity, because that is a really clear, powerful need that has been underrepresented, and it's important that we have a chance to hear women's voices, and that's what we'll get in a little bit. One of the things I'd just like to emphasize in terms of the grand arc of the story we're trying to take a look at is that at the beginning of our journey, when we first encountered Moses Mendelssohn, sometimes called the first modern Jew, his concern was, well, not unlike that which we are really facing today, that of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism of a different form, a statement of how do we change society in such a fundamental way so that the Jew can be at home. And because we have this sense, and we're going to see it a little bit later with Jonathan Sacks, who addresses anti-Semitism in a piece I'm going to share with you, there is this ongoing dynamic that needs to be, in some respects, readdressed in every generation, because it is filled with both commonalities and very clear differences from place to place and time to time. When we first were looking at the life of Moses Mendelssohn and his thinking, he had a twofold kind of agenda. He wanted very much to liberate Jews from all of the restrictions of being nobodies in society, being non-citizens, getting into the mainstream of culture. And he also wanted Jews to reform, with a small r in this case, Judaism, so that its enduring spirit, as he would have described it, could come forth, so that Jews could be a modern religion. And we see that this was all of a piece what would happen in years to come. I'm just taken very much by something that Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister of British Empire in the 19th century, had to say when Queen Victoria asked him if he was an Old Testament or a New Testament person. What was his answer? Neither. I am the blank page between the testaments. And I think that sense of identity at the time was probably pretty common, seeking some place of belonging and not having great clarity for what the Jewish world ought to be all about and Jewish thought ought to be all about. So more thoughts about this will come back, and we'll certainly be taking a look at the thought, at least a bit of it, from the standpoint of time that we have for Lord Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi as well, at the end of our time together here tonight. But at this time, I'm delighted to turn over things to Rabbi Zerin for a very special presentation.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be with you here tonight. And thank you, Rabbi Rosen, for inviting me to join and for your wonderful words of introduction, and for putting together this fabulous class. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all. I'm going to go ahead and get our screen share started. Here we are. All right. So here we are with our third part of the Taste of the Great Modern Jewish Thinkers who have shaped our lives. Hold on. We are not in the right spot. There we go. All right. Here we are now. So among the modern Jewish thinkers, and particularly the modern Jewish biblical thinkers, we would be remiss if we did not include some of the great feminist Jewish biblical thinkers, especially thinking of one of my favorite teachers and one of the most influential scholars, Tikva Freimer-Kensky. She was only with us for a short time from 1943 to 2006, but her legacy is strong. She was born in Chicago, moved to Israel at the age of 10 for 2 years, and she describes herself as someone who was always very bright, very bored in school, and found solace in religious school, right? That was where she went for her intellectual engagement, and where she went to really be nurtured and nourished. And so by the age of 10, she'd already graduated religious school. Thankfully, she went to Israel for these 2 years. And when she came back to New York City, she was looking for more nourishment in her Jewish learning. So she stumbled into Prose Door at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she had a chance to learn with some of the current rabbinical students there, including the great Yochanan Mufs, another great biblicist of of the last century, I guess, of our time. Throughout her childhood, though, she always thought of herself as doing Jewish and biblical studies on the side, was very interested in the sciences. Through undergraduate school, she studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary College at night. And it was really then that she realized that Bible and Jewish studies was what she wanted to do with her life. But at the time, JTS didn't have a graduate school, it only had a rabbinical school, and that rabbinical school only allowed men to enter. So she attended Yale, where she earned her MA and PhD in Assyriology. And initially, she focused on ancient Assyrian texts about crime and punishment, myths of creation, and oaths and ordeals. Her PhD, or her dissertation, was in ordeals in the ancient world. And that was really her focus, sort of in line with the typical canonized things that Assyriologists and biblicists might study. Later in life, she taught at the University of Chicago Divinity School. That's really where she was known for teaching, and I had no other slide to put that on, so I put that here. But how did this woman, who was a well-established Assyriologist, become a foundational feminist biblical scholar? Well, it's a great story. The year was 1978, and she wrote in an essay, she says, "A funny thing happened to me on my way to publishing my dissertation," she says. "I became pregnant. At the time, 1978, academic women were not supposed to notice their pregnancies. We were supposed to carry on as if nothing happened, then take 2 weeks off and come back as if we had taken a brief trip to visit the sites or to visit our relatives." One thing leads to another, and suddenly she finds herself in a situation where she has to go into the hospital that night for an emergency C-section. And so she tells the story as she's packing up her things. "I took along some novels I had saved for after the birth when I had been told I would have time to read, the TV guide, and because of either lunacy or providence, a folder of Sumerian birth incantations that I had collected. That evening, I couldn't get interested in the novels, and I didn't want to watch television. I realized that I didn't want to distract myself. I wanted to concentrate and meditate on the birth. I spent a lovely 3 hours studying the birth incantations, during which time my anxieties melted away into a feeling of being part of a long chain of women giving birth and having difficulty doing so. 10 months later, after I had fully recovered from the birth and the general anesthesia of the C-section, I began to get angry. Why was it that a woman fairly well trained in Judaism and in Christianity had to go all the way to ancient Mesopotamia to find something to read to focus on birth? And what did the poor women who couldn't read ancient Sumerian do? I decided to teach a course on women and religion, and spent the next 2 years reading everything that was beginning to be written in this new field." Now, that next 2 years really turned into the next 30 years of her career. This experience that she had spurred two of her greatest works in very different genres. Mother Prayer, the pregnant woman's spiritual companion, the book that she wished she had had in that moment in the labor and delivery room, that she then wrote for others. Really a populist book, we might say, a book for the every woman and for anyone who might be interested in these texts. And in the wake of the goddesses, women, culture, and the biblical transformation of pagan myth, an academic book that has shaped the field of feminist theology. She wrote later, these two interrelated projects of Mother Prayer and the goddesses were vitally important to me, both as a woman and as a scholar. Through them, I hoped to expand the cultural history of the ancient world to include questions important to women's history and to expand current religion and liturgy to incorporate areas of women's concern. This experience shaped the trajectory of the rest of her writing and the rest of her career, and really the legacy of biblical studies that we inherit today. But before I continue talking about Tikva Frymer-Kensky, I want to make a sidebar for a moment. We'll pause her story to talk for a minute about feminist biblical and feminist religious scholarship. So feminist biblical scholarship, feminist religious scholarship in general, and Jewish studies in particular, was all really part of the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s. During that time, feminist thought began to enter academia in general, and eventually entered the academic study of religion and the Bible, and Jewish studies sort of at that later part of that time. So really, we don't find it entering Jewish studies in a strong presence until the 70s. So it's no surprise that in 1978, when Tikva Frymer-Kensky came to this herself, there wasn't much out there. This came about because there was an awareness that theology, religious studies, and the Bible emerged from patriarchal societies and had been predominantly interpreted by men, but women's voices, stories, roles, and influences are present throughout. There were two major approaches to feminist biblical scholarship and feminist religious scholarship. One was a hermeneutic of suspicion, right? An interpretive approach of suspicion. Really an approach that says, what have we lost by only focusing on men's stories, voices, roles, issues, and interpretations? And even going so far as to say, what harm has this caused? And then there's a hermeneutic of grace, an interpretive stance of grace or of favor of kindness. This was the approach that Tikva Frymer-Kensky and others used, a method of interpretation that recognizes the basic decency and well-meaning character of the biblical authors. I should mention, I realize it's not cited, that quote is actually from a eulogy from one of her colleagues at her funeral, right? That this was the approach she took, a method of interpretation that recognizes the basic decency and well-meaning character of the biblical authors. And it asks, what can we gain by also focusing on women's stories, voices, roles, issues, and interpretations, and what possibilities does this open up? That is the stance that Tikva Frymer-Kensky took. And these are her foundational works. The first was In the Wake of the Goddesses, published in 1992, spurred by that moment in 1978, but it took that long to gather together. It explores what happens in the Bible to the functions once played by goddesses in Mesopotamian religion. Remember, she's coming at this with her background in Assyriology, an ancient Mesopotamian religion. And using that, she sees that the major function of Mesopotamian goddesses was to represent societal ideas about gender, whereas the Bible sees God as non-gendered. The Bible did not have a two-gender view of human nature either. Psychological characteristics were not thought of as male and female, right? The Bible has a non-gendered God gendered only in language because Hebrew forces you to choose male or female pronouns and verbs, but otherwise a non-gendered single God. And because of that, humanity also does not have as strongly a gendered view in the Bible. And therefore, she writes, women are subordinated socially to men, but they are not inferior in any intellectual or spiritual way. There's no essential difference in the Bible between men and women, only because of the social structures that they are put in. This was groundbreaking, both in terms of the way we think about God in the Bible and the way we think about people as portrayed in the Bible. And of course, the relationship between the two. She also states, and it's important to articulate this, that certainly this non-gendered view of God and human nature does not last. But it's not until Second Temple literature and the influence of Greek culture comes in that we start to see these gendered differences emerging in Jewish texts and Jewish ideas. So we see a difference between the Bible as the Bible, the God of the Bible, humanity portrayed in the Bible, and the way that Jewish ideas evolve in later texts and traditions. Mother prayer, we already talked about this anthology of little known prayers, meditations, and reflections on every aspect of female reproductive life. Not only Jewish texts, also drawing from other ancient Near Eastern texts and Christian sources. An important contribution also from a feminist religious perspective, because it elevates sources that had either previously been ignored or underappreciated and brings them into contemporary spiritual life, right? These too are ancient texts that can have meaning for us today. My personal favorite of hers, Reading the Women of the Bible, published in 2002. This was one of her later works. It's a close reading of over 24 biblical narratives about women through linguistic, historical, and literary, critical, and psychological perspectives. It helps to elevate what we can learn about women's stories, women's voices, and the glimpses into women's lives, and shows us what the inclusion of their stories in our canon can teach us about the world of the Bible and about ourselves. I'm going to talk a little bit more about her approach to feminist biblical interpretation in just a moment. Her last book, published right before her death, was Studies in Bible and Feminist Criticism. Much of it is a collection of essays that were written previously. It was part of the JPS Scholar of Distinction series, and she was the first woman to be included in this series, which is another demonstration of the ways in which she was such a groundbreaking scholar. And the introduction is a beautiful personal narrative of her life as a scholar. So not only does it include her scholarly work, but the introduction itself is a sort of autobiographical, reflective piece. When she wrote it, she knew that she was ill. She didn't know how much time she had left, but I imagine that she wrote it knowing it was very much a reflective piece towards the end of her life. I want to go back for a minute to Reading the Women of the Bible and to the ideas that she put forth as a feminist biblical scholar. Right? Her theology comes out mostly in the wake of the goddesses. Her feminist biblical scholarship comes out in Reading the Women of the Bible. So what is the goal of feminist biblical scholarship, or her goal in this book specifically? It's to uncover and pay attention to women's stories, women's voices, and glimpses into women's lives. And to do this, and she's very explicit about this, we have to read these stories on their own terms without traditional interpretations. She calls this a cultural cleaning. Part of the reason for this is that the interpretive tradition we have inherited is predominantly male and predominantly patriarchal. And so to be able to read these stories from a feminist lens, we first have to remove the lens that we've inherited to read the stories on their own terms. Reading them on their own terms means reading them without interpretive traditions, but it doesn't mean to read them in isolation. right? We read these stories individually as individual stories, but we also read them collectively. How can we see patterns emerge from the ways that stories interact with each other? And intertextually, how are stories commenting on each other, drawing on themes from each other, and interpreting each other in certain ways? She often will zoom in on the minutiae of grammar and rhetoric, zoom out to see structural integrity, relationship to biblical literature, law, and social context, and also look at these stories in relationship to the ancient world and global culture. One of the things that I particularly appreciate about her work, and that I think is important to notice and pay attention to in her work and other work of feminist scholars, is that a feminist approach to these texts not only opens up our learning about women's stories, but about how we understand the Bible and Judaism at large. And so I want to share two examples of how this plays out. One is that she comments on how this approach allows us to pay attention to the ways in which, sorry, my panel is blocking the text. There we go. Pay attention to the ways in which the Bible and God in the Bible related to the patriarchy. Did it maintain the status quo, defend it, or advocate for change? And she wrote, there's no ignoring the fact that even though the Bible did not create the patriarchy, it also did not eliminate it. The Bible did not question the patriarchy in the social structure it shared with the rest of the ancient world, just as it did not question another glaring social inequity, that of slavery. However, the Bible also does not defend the status quo, for the idea of social revolution is integral to biblical thought. God is a God of change, for God elevates the lowly, brings the marginalized to the center, and raises high the socially inferior. In this way, power and privilege are necessarily impermanent. So this takes a feminist perspective to look at one of the main themes of the Bible, and one of the main ways that the Bible understands God in the world. She also suggests that we should notice the ways that portrayal of women shapes and impacts the greater whole. And here she points out that the Bible's view of gender sets up a dramatic clash between theory and reality. On the one hand, women occupied a socially subordinate position. On the other hand, the Bible did not label them as inferior. And she goes on, the rest of this quote goes on to compare that to the role of Israel as a nation itself, right? Israel throughout most of history is subordinate to ruling nations, but that does not make Israel inferior, right? And towards the end, she says, Israel was subject to the power and authority of others on an international level, just as women were subordinate within Israelite society. And the Bible's own image of women enabled its thinkers to accept this powerlessness without translating it into a sense of inferiority or worthlessness. In this way, the Bible's image of women was an essential element in its self-image and its understanding of Israel's destiny. Paying attention to the way that women are portrayed in the Bible helps us understand the self-image of Israel as a nation. I want to close with a few words from her about the ways that she related to Torah, to Bible study, and to the work that she did, because I think that also impacts both how we understand her and how we can understand the richness of this approach. She wrote, I am keenly aware of the voices of ancient writers composing the Bible and of the hands of the anonymous tradents who preserved it over the ages. The verses in the Bible call me into conversation with them and with other readers through time. And since the authors are trying to make a place for God in this world, they and I are engaged in a holy activity. The world has changed, and the old answers can no longer suit the old purposes of improving the life of all human beings or of magnifying the holiness of the world. but the ancient questions which come from careful attention to both the text and the needs of the people still demand attention. When I study, these ancient authors speak to me and I join them. I bring my contemporary perspectives, my scholarly expertise, and my woman's sensibility into the conversation with them. I seek to understand their texts, to see how their texts can become mine, and how my voice can help these texts speak to the modern world. The process of studying Torah is twofold. It is both an intellectual occupation and a spiritual exercise in seeking the multifaceted nature of God, reality, and truth. Sometimes there is yet a third reward to studying Torah, as the process of learning illuminates some facet of today's world. This reorientation in my thinking made me aware that my studies could have ramifications on the spiritual lives of people who might never even hear my name. She wrote this a little over a year before her passing, and I would like to think that we all have felt the ramifications on our own spiritual lives of her work, and it's been a privilege to share her name with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Zerin. And it's an ongoing and a beautiful challenge to reread our tradition, reread our texts, let those texts speak to us, but also to allow ourselves the luxury and really the necessity of being able to see them through very different lenses, especially the ones that we're not accustomed to putting on sometimes. So that is a remarkable and a necessary compliment to all that we have been talking about. Moving on to the last of our thinkers from this mini series, just to recall that one of the themes that we've been really touching upon is the degree with which Jewish thinkers really struggled with the need, the necessity of trying to come up with ways, not simply to make sense of Judaism for themselves, but for their offspring, for their children, and for society around them. In some cases, an almost apologetic kind of thing. When you go back and look at the history of the naming of Jewish institutions, think about how many of them have the word Hebrew before them, right? Hebrew homes and Hebrew federations and all sorts of other agencies that have that term before. In France, I think it was, I'm not going to try to pronounce the French, but it was some form of the word Israelite that would be at the core of communal institutions. Now that would change later on. There would be a greater source of comfort with the word Jewish, but you almost got the sense that in some respects, that especially in America, in 19th century America, and into the 20th century as well, the word Jewish was too Jewish. The word Hebrew harkened back to everything that those Enlightenment, the Haskalah Jews wanted. They wanted a biblically based kind of way of looking at the world. And so, interestingly enough, you have the change of direction of things that have happened even in our own time. The Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which was the congregational arm of the Reform movement, still is the congregational arm, but it changed names to the Union for Reform Judaism, so that it has the word Jewish Judaism in it. If you go to the website of that union, you will see that it is filled with pictures of very wide-ranging individuals. There's a great diversity there, all wearing talitot, all wearing kippot, which probably was a totally very different pathway than what the original reformers had in mind. But there is a sense of evolution and of comfort with this. But there is one additional step that we really need to point out. And even in the midst of all of these various periods of tremendous challenge with anti-Semitism and steps backward when it came to Jewish acceptance in society at large, increasingly Jews became aware of the reality that we had something to teach the world at large. That it wasn't just that Judaism for our own purposes was a combination of modernity, whenever that modernity took place, along with Torah, but That is a recipe of something the world itself ought to learn from and can learn from. And that indeed it is not only a possibility of speaking out that way, it is a duty to speak out that way. Not because we want the rest of the world to become Jewish. That isn't the idea. That's not the task. Remembering that rabbinic phrase that the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come, which is to say, geh gesund or hate, be whatever you would like to be a moral person, be a good person, but still listen to what we have to say too. And it just might translate to a kind of chokhmah, a kind of applied wisdom that ought to make a difference or could make a difference in your life. That being the case, we turn now to Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who sadly died a couple of years ago, all too young in our minds, certainly because he made enormous, enormous contributions to that particular task. We could analyze the thought of Jonathan Sacks for hours. And I know that many, many books will be written about him in the years ahead. I want to focus primarily on one feature of his thinking, and that really is speaking the truths that Judaism has to offer, the wisdom it has to offer to the world at large. Just as a brief aside, we began at the beginning of this little time together that we have looking at the Victorian period in England and in the UK. That is also the time in which there was the beginning of this office, the office of Chief Rabbi of the British Empire. Turns out he wasn't really representing the entire British Empire, but that's another story. And it was meant to be something that was akin to the Archbishop of Canterbury, this, the leader of the national religion of the British Empire. So there was a sense there would be some kind of similarity that way. And there have been multiple chief rabbis ever since and to this very day. What was at stake with Jonathan Sacks? He had no intention of becoming a rabbi initially. He went to school, he studied economics and philosophy. That was really his first love, philosophy in particular. And it was through some happenstance meetings with a variety of very key individuals. That's another story again. He ultimately chose to go into that path. And having done so, he has been one of the most influential thinkers, I think, in many respects. Our closing little clip today will be a clip from a TED Talk that he gave in 2017. You know, if you're giving a TED Talk, you've hit the big time. It's not too often that you get Jewish thinkers who are international rock stars, but so be it. That's what he has become. He is the author of 25 books. He has been, he's frequently spoken in the British Parliament. He was tapped very often to be on the BBC's program Thought for the Day. And not incidentally, he was invited to the wedding of Princess William and Kate Middleton. So for whatever that's worth, I guess that's important too. In the first decade of his service, he was chief rabbi from 1991 to 2013. In the first decade of his service, he focused on themes of love of God, love of Jews and Judaism, love of British society, and love of Israel. But in the second decade of his tenure, he began to focus on something very different. He began to look at Judaism and religion as a whole through ethical lenses and began to ask the question, where do I, as a traditional Orthodox rabbi, have something to say about the universal application of Jewish themes to the rest of the world? So in addition to all of his very numerous and very brilliant commentaries on the Torah, for the sake of Jewish edification, he began to see how indeed these things could be expanded. And the breakthrough book, I think, for many, was the book, The Dignity of Difference, that came as a response to 9/11, in which he argued, as here again, a traditional rabbi, that it is in understanding those who are least like us that we come to make the greatest impact on the world. Let's see if we can unpack some of this in a more specific fashion for the time that we have. And I see we have a couple of chat issues, and maybe we'll take a look at them collectively when we're done. Chat questions. So let me see if I can just go ahead here a little bit. He says this is from his last book, Morality is the title in essence. Religion survives because it is vital in one respect. It answers three questions that every reflective person must ask. Who am I? Why am I here? How then shall I live? Now, these are not psychological questions per se. The first one could well be placed in that category, I suppose, right? We're always trying to understand exactly what makes us tick and others around us. But fundamentally, it's a basic question of philosophy of life. Am I just occupying space on this earth? Am I just a random collection of molecules? Is it the fact that I am an accident of birth? Is that enough to be able to justify my existence for the long term? And the argument of religion, and the key term here might be indeed reflective, right? Reflective person, because it's very easy to get through life without being terribly reflective. And that is that you have to find not only a sense of meaning, but you have to understand the possibility of living that on a daily basis. His first three fundamental questions. And then he takes a look at society. He looks at American society, he looks at British society. And he talks about what he calls a hotel culture. A hotel culture. A hotel is where you stay. It's not where you belong. You feel no loyalty to a hotel. You don't put down roots there. It doesn't become part of your identity. Yes, after a while, you recognize your fellow guests, but it remains a place where everyone is, in the biblical phrase, a stranger and a sojourner. This has a twofold application, among others, to be sure. But if you remember, when we were talking about Martin Buber a couple of weeks ago, Buber was emphasizing the fact that we are an I-it culture. The people around us are its. They exist in essence, for the most part, to serve our needs. And if they're just instrumentally around for that purpose, we won't care about them too much. We want to make sure that they will be there when we check out at the grocery store and when we get our packages in the mail. But we don't have any loyalty to them. So Buber wants us to have that I-thou relationship with others. And he is saying, Sacks is saying, I think, that we have to move from a recognition of the common humanity that we have. And if we're not going to love everybody in a deep and wonderful fashion, nonetheless, we dare not see them as mere its, mere instruments. And the title of the book, which is kind of routed out by mine anyhow, The Home That We Build Together, it's a different vision of society. It's not just a bunch of isolated individuals in different hotel rooms who commonly get together in the lobby for 10 seconds. It's a vested interest in the culture and in the well-being of the society we live in, and to make a difference. That's what counts. That's what's important. And that is what we need to take great pains to create. So how do we get around the reality of, or deal with the reality of life? The dominant approach to life in our world today, he would say, is secularism. And secularism is not entirely an evil, horrible thing. A secular government, which is separated from religion, is a very good thing. A secular way of looking at the world has yielded us the advancement of science in many, many respects, and has given us technological means of doing things that were a dream, a pipe dream, generations ago. The market, he talks about in a second, we'll get to the market. But there's something missing in a secular vision. Homo sapiens, that's us, meaning-seeking animals. If there is one thing the great institutions of the modern world do not do, it is to provide meaning. Thank you. So science can tell us how, but not why. Technology gives us power, can't tell us how to use the power. We can use it for destruction. We can use it to enhance life. The market gives us choices, but leaves us uninstructed. And this last line is, I think, one of his most quoted ones. Broadcasting is being replaced by narrowcasting. Now, millions and millions of people tonight are going on their favorite news sites to vindicate whatever they thought the president's press conference was all about. It was a wonderful breath of fresh air. It was just a horrible, bumbling disaster. And unless you read somebody else's perspective, that's exactly what's going to be reinforced. We don't broadcast, we narrowcast. And when you become hardened in your perspective that way, then this is how hate increases. This is how closed-mindedness increases, and this is how people get hurt. So we have to have the power of religion and the power of open-mindedness to make that difference. Go ahead to something else. And he carries on about something else. This is where the Jewish piece comes in. When he, as a scholar, as a teacher, as a rabbi, as a great communicator, his lyrical reaches of language are magnificent. He has a fabulous, fabulous sense of humor. And he has a depth of knowledge that is incredibly impressive. But he, like any of us, opens up our Torah, our Tanakh, our Hebrew Bible, and you can start to get curious. Let me give you a few examples of curiosities. What does it mean that? That's, I think, a key leading question we often have to ask. What does it mean that in the spirit of this week's Torah reading, the hero and the name of the Torah portion where we get the 10 Commandments has nothing to do with the 10 Commandments. It's a father-in-law, a sympathetic father-in-law. Would that everybody has great relationships with fathers-in-law that Moses had. And what is the message that father-in-law Jethro gives to Moses? Listen, Moses, before you go on the mountain and start getting the 10 Commandments, you're working too hard and you're not learning how to prioritize all of your judgments of what the people are bringing to you. You're going to burn out. I tell you, I have the secret word for you, delegate, which is what Moses then does. Jethro, is a hero. Why is it that when little baby Moses is in the water to be saved from Pharaoh's horrible genocidal decree, of all of the people to save him is the daughter of the tyrant, the daughter of Pharaoh? Why is it that when we have a decree from God that the Ninevites are going to be overcome and punished if they don't repent? The Ninevites are not Jewish, right? Syriology would help with that, actually, wouldn't it? Right? That's the area of the world. But they're not Jewish. So what happens? Jonah, this not only reluctant prophet, he's a rebel. He doesn't want to do this. He runs away. That's why he gets swallowed up by the big fish in the first place, because he is refusing his duty. The heroes of the story are the Ninevites and the king. They hear from God. They're going to be overwhelmed. They repent. That's why it's a short book, in part. All of the prophets of Israel get no such satisfaction when they talk to various Israelites in various parts of the Jewish world. This Jewish people are an Amkshe Orav, constantly stubborn. It's the non-Jews who repent. Now, I'm not trying to sugarcoat things because there are plenty of situations and plenty of dynamics in which the non-Jewish world is painted in a much more demonic way, let's say. But there's enough of that to raise questions in any sensitive reader's mind about Torah and what it can be applied, how it can be applied to the broader society. And you scratch your head when you say, gee, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and might. Boy, that's a tall order. I bet I'm going to see that a lot when I go through the rest of the Torah. But you don't. But what you do see 36 times is not oppressing the stranger, embrace the stranger, love the stranger. You are strangers in Egypt. Be sensitized. When you see all of that, you realize our texts have a broader purpose than just making Jews Jewish. And the byproduct of that, by the way, is when others are capable of embracing wisdom, again, not converting to Judaism, just embracing how they could apply this wisdom to their lives, then we become more Jewish. That's one of his teachings. So how does this really get manifest? As a student of language too, he takes a look and he realizes, there is no natural word in Hebrew for history. It had to be, in a sense, imported. It's a rich word, historia. If you knew no other Hebrew, you would know what that word meant. Historia, history. It had to be created. It had to be invented because we have memories. So outsourcing, that's a part of our modern world, to be sure, a big part of our modern world. But there's also been not just the outsourcing of labor with all of the problems that creates, all the issues. The outsourcing, little notice, the outsourcing of memory. We have larger and larger memories in computers and smartphones. Our memories and those of our children have got smaller and smaller. We have confused history and memory, which are not at all the same thing. History is an answer to the question, what happened? Memory is an answer to the question, that's going back to his first slide, right? Who am I? History is about facts. Memory is about identity. History is his story. It could be her story too, believe me, right? Memory is my story, the past that made me who I am, of whose legacy I am the guardian. We are guardians of that. And this is, I can't quite see it because this is being blocked, but I think it says, because I've read it 1,000 times, a free society is a moral achievement. A moral achievement. Okay? So the world does not have to worry about being obligated to eat matzah and bitter herbs on Pesach. But the world will do very well to take the lesson that when we sit down at a Seder table, we are eating our history. We are making it personal. We are making it passionately dynamic. And we should have that as well as an ongoing lesson as well. It's what you would do, how you apply the pieces of the past to where we are today. Okay, so what have we done? We have lived the precise opposite of outsourcing. We have had the internalization of that which has been external. Now, this is an interesting kind of irony here. Wherever in the world Jews prayed, there was the temple. There was the temple, right? Whether you were in Dubuque, Iowa, or whether you were in Jerusalem or in West Hartford or Avon or Simsbury, there was the temple. Every prayer was a sacrifice, every Jew a priest, every community a fragment of Jerusalem. Now, if we were doing a lot of give and take, I would ask you, who does it sound like? And if you were to say classical Reform Judaism, I think you'd be right, ironically enough, because remember, we talked about that last time, that to use the word temple to name congregations was a way of saying we don't believe any longer. This is the early part of Reform Judaism before it really, really changed radically to become much more Zionistic, because Stuttgart is our Jerusalem now. But I think that what he is saying here is very different, because as an Orthodox Jew, he prayed 3 times a day for the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem and the sacrificial system. And his prayer books that he wrote and edited say the same thing. But we took with us in exile the ideas that wherever we are, we can apply in very vivid ways what we can do. You can't go to Jerusalem and offer a sacrifice, but you can pray. And it's as if it was the temple when you walk into your synagogue. Your prayer is as if it was a passionately offered sacrifice. And we uplift ourselves with dignity when we conduct ourselves in that way, and every community a fragment of Jerusalem. I like that idea. Jerusalem and West Hartford go together very nicely. Okay. Now here's the problem. He was never afraid of taking on one of the most critical issues of modern life, and that is religion has been a tool of hatred. It has been a tool of cruelty. It has been a tool of breaking apart families and societies and groups on many, many different levels. There was a motto that was circulating around in the Enlightenment period, going back to that first time that we took a look at in the 18th century. Enlightenment people believed that religion would be essentially mute, marginal, and mild. Mute, it wouldn't talk very much, if at all. It would be marginal. It would be on the outskirts. You know, what people did in their free time and, didn't want to bother anybody else with. And it would be mild. It wouldn't bother anybody, except for a few problems. Religion became, in its worst expressions, explosive. And I don't have to elucidate that. We all know how that has taken place. And minimally, it has become a dynamic source of people's values that has, in many respects, competed with any other thought systems that are out there, and what people have just kind of assumed on their own. It hasn't retreated into any kind of dust. So If it is strong enough, and he believes it is, to bring peace between religions, it has to look internally. This is, by the way, an echo of the beginning of Heschel's God in Search of Man. If religion is seen to be, in some respects, insipid and dull and irrelevant, don't blame others, blame yourselves. We are part of the problem. So make it a part of the solution. We have to have the courage in the 21st century to heal this ancient rift, because that's what God is calling upon us to do. That's the key goal, the key need in our era. That is what he wrote in the beginning of the 2000s, the 21st century. And as a part of that, he had a lot to say about what modernity has created. And he has a lot to say about anti-Semitism. And I wasn't initially going to bring this to our attention tonight, because after all, there's so much else to talk about with the panoply of his writings. But obviously the events of the past weekend bring this to light. And I want you to see that in the context of the theme of bringing truth to power, a la the kinds of things that Elie Wiesel would do. Remember Elie Wiesel speaking to then President Reagan in 1986 and saying, don't go to Bitburg where the SS soldiers are buried, your place isn't there. That took a certain amount of courage, but thank God he did it. Didn't, at the end of the day, work, but it made a big statement about the fact that we're not retiring into retreating rather into a hole someplace. But it's a fascinating thing that he, in his address to the House of Lords, here he is speaking in the English Parliament about anti-Semitism. Talk about being more comfortable in one's skin, and also saying that Judaism has something to say about what's going on. But he says, understand, people, it's a mutating virus. We have two viruses, in a sense, going on at the same time, don't we, COVID? The hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. This is sometimes called the miner's canary theory of anti-Semitism, right? The canary goes down into the mine to see if there are any fumes. And, you know, that's so that it's safe for the miners to go down there. But if you're a miner's canary in history, understand that that which would poison you is going to ultimately poison others. That's, I think, what he's referring to here. The appearance of anti-Semitism in a culture is the first symptom of a disease, the early warning sign of collective breakdown. And it's not here that he's talking about the fact that we see, and I think there's great truth to this, that one of the key enduring issues of anti-Semitism is the fact that it's a reflection of a sense that Jews are constantly involved in conspiracies. Right? That's not his agenda quite here, but it is the sense that if you tolerate anti-Semitism, it's not that Jews alone are going to suffer. Society is going to suffer. Other people are going to suffer. Not liking Jews is not anti-Semitism. It's not great, right? But that isn't what we're talking about. We all have people we don't like. It's denying the right of Jews to exist collectively as Jews with the same rights as everyone else. And it takes different forms in different ages. Prior to some more recent events, you know, the shootings of the last few years in particular, he would have come to identify both the extremes of the right, but also on the left. And he was one of the most strident voices in declaring that so much of the anti-Zionism that is depicted throughout much of the world is a very, very thinly veiled anti-Semitism. And he wasn't afraid of taking on individuals in the Labour Party in Britain that he believed, and others do as well, were touting very not just anti-Israel, but anti-Semitic kinds of screeds. Okay, and here is where we're going to end. This is just a couple of minutes. And at the end, we should have a few minutes anyhow. And please feel free to address, we'll have time for a few questions anyhow to either Rabbi Zerin or myself. What I'm sharing with you is a talk that he gave in 2017. And despite the fact that there are all of these challenges in society, all of these terribly complex matters, never give up hope. And he offers a bit of a recipe. It's also reflected in particular in his last book on morality. But I just wanted to give us, as we did before with Heschel and at least with some of the other pictures, some sense of the person, because at the end of the day, you really can't separate the person entirely from the message. So with a little bit of luck, this is going to work now, and I hope you'll be able to hear it okay. This is the last couple of minutes of a TED Talk he gave on hope and not fear.
It's how magical thinking has taken over our politics. So we say, all you've got to do is elect this strong leader, and he or she will solve all our problems for us. Believe me, that is magical thinking. And then we get the extremes, the far right, the far left, the extreme religious and the extreme anti-religious, the far right dreaming of a golden age that never was, the far left dreaming of a utopia that never will be, and the religious and anti-religious equally convinced that all it takes is God or the absence of God to save us from ourselves. That too is magical thinking.
Stop.
Oh. Is that the end?
No, it's not the end. Wait, there's more.
Because the only people who will save us from ourselves is we, the people, all of us together. And when we do that, and when we move from the politics of me to the politics of all of us together, we rediscover those beautiful, counterintuitive truths that a nation is strong when it cares for the weak, that it becomes rich when it cares for the poor, it becomes invulnerable when it cares about the vulnerable. That is what makes great nations. So here is my simple suggestion. It might just change your life, and it might just help to begin to change the world. Do a search and replace operation on the text of your mind. And wherever you encounter the word self, substitute the word other. So instead of self-help, other help. Instead of self-esteem, other esteem. And if you do that, you will begin to feel the power of what, for me, is one of the most moving sentences in all of religious literature. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. We can face any future without fear, so long as we know we will not face it alone. So, for the sake of the future you, together, let us strengthen the future us. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we've come quite a distance, having begun with the sense of insecurity. How can we make it in a world that won't accept us very much? And as with a religion that is misunderstood and is vilified, to a public intellectual who says, you too can transform the world with the lessons of Judaism. And there's hope. There's reason for hope, always reason for hope. So with that, I'm going to stop here. And let's see if we can find, see the chat just disappeared, we'll bring it up. We can answer a little bit of what, the best way to do it. Okay. that's yours.
So someone asked, do I think Tikva Fremmer-Kensky would have entered the rabbinate if it was open to her in her day? That's a great question, and one that probably has been posed to her that she must have answered at some point. I don't know. I know that she longed to study in spaces that were closed to her, but I don't know if the rabbinate would have been her place. I think that had it been, we would have gained something great, and we would have also lost something great, because her seriousness as a scholar has enabled her to make an imprint not only on Jewish thought and Jewish approaches to the Bible, but on all of religious academia and religious theology and religious approaches to the Bible in ways that, had she pursued the rabbinate and not academia, I don't think she would have had that same breadth of impact. She was no stranger to rabbis. Her husband was a rabbi. She, was very much part of that rabbinic family. But whether or not she would have opted for that path had it been open to her, I think that it might have been a loss in a lot of ways, even though I'm sure we would have gained much as well. So it's an interesting question. I don't know if she ever answered it directly, but thank you for asking it so we can speculate about it. And I think the next question is for you about book recommendations.
Okay, well, that's that's a challenge. I would say the two books that are of immediate significance, if you can get your hands on The Dignity of Difference, it's 20 years old, but it has a fundamentally radical change of perspective that I think is really worth encountering. And I would also take a look at his most recent and last book, sadly, Morality, because it is more timely in terms of many of the issues that are raised there. And a treasure trove of materials of his are online, including weekly commentaries on the Torah portion of the week. And you can see his addresses to various individuals and various groups that bestowed honors upon him. So that would be a good place to start. Okay. So I'm going to just stop here. Thank you, everyone, so very, very much for joining us. Thank you, Rabbi Zerin.
Thank you.
For having joined us here. And we look forward to continuing in future times to have a chance to come together this way, and even better to come together in person when it's safe and possible to do so, because the give and take of feedback is the most joyous part of this of all. Thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you all.